In the summer of 146 BC, a Roman general named Scipio Aemilianus stood on a hill overlooking a burning city and wept. The city was Carthage. It had been his enemy's capital, the greatest commercial power the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced, and for 17 days it had been dying in front of him. When the fires finally went out, Rome walked into the ruins and did something historians have argued about for 2,000 years. They wrote the story of what Carthage had been. For 20 centuries, that story has been the only one available. Carthage as a city of merchants without culture. Carthage as a civilization that burned its own children alive. Carthage as a cruel Eastern power correctly destroyed by a rational Western republic. Every school child who ever learned about the Punic Wars learned it through Roman eyes. Now, a series of excavations across Tunisia, Sicily, and Sardinia have begun producing evidence that contradicts the Roman account on nearly every significant point. Not one artifact, not one inscription. A convergence of findings from archaeology, forensic analysis, isotope chemistry, and ancient DNA work that, taken together, forces the entire narrative to be rewritten. Who the Carthaginians actually were, what they actually built, and what Rome had actually chosen to erase. The problem with everything we thought we knew about Carthage begins with a single, uncomfortable fact. Almost nothing written by a Carthaginian has survived. The libraries of Carthage, according to the Roman historian Pliny, contained thousands of volumes at the moment of the city's destruction. Agricultural treatises, historical chronicles, religious texts, navigational records, the accumulated written memory of a civilization that had dominated Mediterranean trade for 600 years. When the city fell, Rome distributed those libraries to allied kings in North Africa. Every single volume vanished. Not one complete Carthaginian book exists anywhere on Earth today. What we have instead are the accounts written by their enemies: Livy, Polybius, Appian, Diodorus, Greek and Roman authors composing their descriptions of Carthaginian society decades or centuries after Carthage no longer existed to contradict them. It is the equivalent of reconstructing modern American culture using only documents written by people who fought wars against it. For 2,000 years, that was the source material historians were forced to work with. The imbalance was structural, not accidental. Rome had made certain of that. Then, in the 1920s, a French archaeologist named Louis Poinsot began digging into a specific area outside the ruins of ancient Carthage in what is now Tunisia. The site was called the Tophet. What he found there would become the single most damning piece of evidence against Carthaginian civilization for the next 100 years. Thousands of small urns buried in tight formation, each one containing the cremated bones of infants and very young children. Above many of the urns stood carved stone markers, some depicting the Carthaginian goddess Tanit, some inscribed with dedications to gods. The interpretations seemed to confirm everything the Roman sources had claimed. Ancient authors described Carthaginians throwing living children into the flames of a bronze statue of the god Baal Hammon. Poinsot appeared to have located the physical evidence. The Tophet was the child sacrifice ground. Carthage had been what Rome said it was. For 8 decades, that interpretation held. The reassessment began quietly. In the late 2000s, a team led by anthropologist Jeffrey Schwartz at the University of Pittsburgh obtained access to the actual skeletal material recovered from the Tophet urns. The bones themselves, not the interpretations of them, not the drawings, not the summary reports written by earlier excavators. The team applied a battery of techniques that had not existed when Poinsot was working. Detailed dental analysis to determine the age at death, assessment of skeletal development markers, chemical analysis of the burnt bone to determine whether the individuals had been alive at the moment of cremation or had died beforehand. The results, published in 2010 and expanded in subsequent studies, contradicted the sacrificial interpretation almost point by point. A substantial percentage of the individuals in the Tophet had died before birth. Stillborn infants and late-term fetuses whose skeletal age placed them clearly before the moment of live delivery. These children could not have been sacrificed. They had never lived to be killed. Many others had died in the first weeks of life, an age range that matches, with grim precision, the neonatal mortality rate of every pre-modern society ever studied. Ancient infant mortality was catastrophic by modern standards. A Mediterranean city of Carthage's size would have produced hundreds of infant deaths every year from disease, birth complications, and the ordinary tragedies of life before medicine. The Tophet, in the reading that emerged from the new analysis, was not a sacrificial ground. It was a specialized cemetery for the youngest members of the community, a burial site set apart because those particular deaths required particular rites. The urns, the markers, the dedications to gods, all of it was consistent with a culture that treated infant death as sacred and worthy of formal ceremony, not with a culture that manufactured infant death for religious purposes. The debate is not fully resolved. Some scholars continue to argue that occasional sacrifice did occur, layered on top of ordinary infant burial. The evidence does not permit certainty in either direction. What it does not permit any longer is the confident assertion that Carthage was defined by systematic ritual killing of its own children. That claim, the foundational accusation of the Roman account, no longer stands on the archaeological record. It stands still on the word of the people who burned the city down. The second collapse in the Roman narrative came from a place nobody had thought to look carefully: the seabed. Carthaginian ships were legendary in antiquity. The Romans themselves admitted this. When the First Punic War began in 264 BC, Rome had almost no navy. Carthage had the finest fleet in the Mediterranean. According to Polybius, the Romans built their first serious warships by copying a Carthaginian vessel that had run aground on the Italian coast. The learning curve was catastrophic. Rome lost tens of thousands of men and hundreds of ships in early engagements before they became competent at sea. But how good were Carthaginian ships, actually? Descriptions in ancient sources are contradictory and vague. The construction techniques, the design philosophy, the level of standardization involved, all of it was speculative for centuries because no substantially intact Carthaginian warship had ever been recovered. That changed off the western coast of Sicily. Near a small island called Marettimo, marine archaeologists working across several decades located the wreckage of Carthaginian warships that had gone down during a battle in 241 BC. The find was extraordinary. Multiple hulls, timbers preserved in the anaerobic sediment of the seabed, and, critically, construction markings. The Carthaginian shipbuilders had labeled their timbers. Individual pieces of wood carried inscribed letters and symbols indicating exactly how each component fit into the finished vessel. It was, in effect, a prefabrication system. Ships were being built from standardized parts, produced in advance, and assembled to a common design. The implications for what Carthage actually was economically are significant. This is not the technology of a city that simply traded well. This is industrial-scale naval production, organized around a level of technical standardization that Rome would not match for another century. The wrecks also confirmed the sheer scale of the Carthaginian fleet. Ancient sources claimed Carthage could put hundreds of warships to sea simultaneously. The archaeological record now supports that claim. A civilization that mass-produces warships from labeled components is a civilization operating at a level of engineering sophistication that the surviving Roman descriptions systematically underplayed. Rome had described Carthage as a nation of merchants. The Marettimo wrecks describes something else, a nation of engineers. The third pillar of the traditional account concerns what kind of people Carthaginians were. Roman sources are consistent on this. Punica fides, Punic faith, became a Latin proverb for treachery. Carthaginians were, in the Roman telling, deceitful, cruel, luxurious, and fundamentally alien to the disciplined virtues of the Italian peninsula. The stereotype was so complete and so persistent that it survived the destruction of the city by 20 centuries. The genetic record has begun to complicate this picture in ways that the Roman authors could not have anticipated. In the 2010s and 2020s, teams working on ancient DNA extraction from Punic-era burials across the Western Mediterranean began publishing results that reframe the question of who Carthaginians actually were. Carthage was founded, according to tradition, by settlers from the Phoenician city of Tyre in what is now Lebanon. The expected genetic signature, if the traditional account were accurate, would be predominantly Levantine, with the Carthaginian population maintaining a strong Eastern Mediterranean profile across the centuries. That is not what the DNA showed. The genetic profile of the Punic-era population, as recovered from burials in Tunisia, Sardinia, Sicily, and Ibiza, is startlingly diverse. Levantine ancestry is present, but it is one strand among many. North African Berber ancestry, Sicilian and Southern Italian ancestry, Iberian ancestry, Aegean ancestry. The Carthaginian world was genetically cosmopolitan to a degree that has few parallels in the ancient Mediterranean. This is not a colony that maintained its founding population intact. This is a civilization that absorbed, intermarried with, and integrated peoples from across its trading network on a scale that shaped its population at the level of the genome. The Carthage of the DNA record is not a Phoenician outpost preserving Eastern purity. It is a Mediterranean melting pot, a commercial civilization whose citizens carried the genetic evidence of the connections their ships had made. The stereotype of the alien Easterner, isolated by culture and blood from the peoples around him, does not survive contact with the actual genetic data. The economic reassessment has moved in parallel with the biological one. For a long time, Carthage was described as a trading empire that produced little of its own. A middleman civilization, moving goods without generating them, wealthy but shallow. This description was already dubious given the naval evidence, and recent work on the Tunisian hinterland has demolished it entirely. Extensive agricultural surveys and archaeological excavations across the Cap Bon Peninsula and the fertile plains inland from Carthage have revealed a landscape that was intensively developed. Terraced farming, sophisticated irrigation, olive presses at industrial scale, wine production for export, granaries capable of storing enormous surpluses. The Carthaginian agricultural writer Mago, whose works Rome preserved in translation for exactly this reason, was considered so authoritative that the Roman Senate ordered his agricultural treatise saved from the general destruction of the libraries. Even Rome could not afford to destroy what Carthage knew about farming. The evidence in the soil confirms why. Carthage did not simply trade Mediterranean goods. It produced them at a scale and efficiency that its rivals studied and emulated. The wealth of the city, in the picture emerging from the ground, did not come from cleverness at the marketplace. It came from a productive base that fed itself, exported surpluses, and financed the fleet that carried them. There is a specific archaeological find that has come to symbolize the reassessment of Carthaginian sophistication. In the ruins of the residential districts on the Byrsa Hill, the central acropolis of ancient Carthage, excavators have uncovered urban planning that predates the Roman destruction by more than a century. The houses were multi-story. Some had running water. The streets were laid out on a regular grid. Buildings shared walls in coordinated blocks. Public baths, drainage systems, and paved thoroughfares indicate a city organized around civic infrastructure that the residents took for granted. This is the physical fabric of a metropolis, not a trading post. And it existed at a level of development that, When Rome finally caught up architecturally in the following centuries, Roman authors would describe as though it had been invented in Italy. Some of it had not been. Some of it had been standing in Carthage while Rome was still a walled town of dirt streets. The archaeological record shows the sequence clearly. The written record, produced by the winners, does not. The reassessment extends even to the wars themselves. The Roman account of the Punic Wars presents them as a clash between disciplined republican virtue and Eastern despotism. Hannibal, in this telling, was a military genius, but his civilization behind him was decadent and unable to sustain him. The Roman victory was the victory of a better society over a worse one. Recent military historical work, drawing on Carthaginian coinage, inscriptions from Spain and North Africa, and the physical remains of Punic-era military infrastructure, has produced a very different picture. The Carthaginian state, during the Second Punic War, was not the exhausted mercantile oligarchy of Roman description. It was an organized, functional civilization capable of raising massive armies, supplying them across continents, and coordinating military operations from Spain to Italy to Sicily simultaneously. The reason Hannibal came so close to destroying Rome was not that he was a lone genius operating despite his own society. It was that his society was fully capable of sustained war on multiple fronts and did so for decades. That Rome eventually won does not mean Rome was more advanced. It means Rome was more willing to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting after every other Mediterranean power would have negotiated. The Punic Wars were closer than the Roman narrative admits, and they were closer because Carthage was more formidable than the Roman narrative allowed itself to describe. None of this is to suggest that Carthaginian civilization was somehow morally superior to Rome, or free of the cruelties that define all ancient societies. That is not the argument the evidence makes. Carthage practiced slavery. Carthage fought aggressive wars. Carthage projected imperial power across the Western Mediterranean and did not do so gently. The argument the evidence makes is narrower and, in some ways, more disturbing. It is that a specific civilization was destroyed, and then the people who destroyed it were left as the only witnesses to what had existed. For 2,000 years, historians worked from those witnesses because there was nothing else. And for 2,000 years, the picture they produced was systematically distorted in ways that only the recovery of physical evidence could correct. Consider what that means as a general principle. Carthage was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the ancient Mediterranean. It produced writers, philosophers, generals, engineers, and priests. It maintained diplomatic relations with every major power of its age. When it was destroyed, all of that intellectual production disappeared, and the historical record of it was written entirely by its enemy. If this could happen to Carthage, it has happened to others. The archaeological record is now beginning to recover the voices of civilizations that lost their wars and lost, with them, the right to describe themselves. Carthage is the most visible case because the destruction was the most complete and the enemy was the most literarily prolific. It is not the only case. The final piece of the reassessment involves what happened after the destruction. Rome did not simply burn Carthage. Rome, according to a well-known ancient tradition, salted the earth where the city had stood, ensuring nothing would grow there again. This detail has been repeated in histories, textbooks, and popular accounts for centuries as an example of the totality of the Roman erasure. Modern scholarship has quietly acknowledged that the salting of Carthage almost certainly never happened. The earliest source for the claim dates from more than 1,000 years after the destruction. No contemporary account mentions it. The soil chemistry of the ancient site shows no evidence of salt contamination. The story appears to be a medieval invention grafted onto the ancient event, but the reason the story stuck is more telling than whether it was true. Rome had erased Carthage so completely from the historical record that when later ages tried to imagine what that erasure had looked like, they reached for a physical metaphor equal to the cultural one. Salting the earth was invented because it fit what Rome had actually done, which was to salt the memory. The ground itself, as it turns out, remembered better than the manuscripts did. The bones in the Tophet urns preserved the truth about what had happened to Carthaginian infants. The timbers off Maretimo preserved the truth about Carthaginian shipbuilding. The DNA in Punic burials preserved the truth about Carthaginian population. The farms in the Tunisian countryside preserved the truth about Carthaginian production. The houses on the Bursa Hill preserved the truth about Carthaginian urbanism. Each of these findings is significant on its own. Together, they describe a civilization that Rome had every reason to caricature and every capacity to caricature successfully, because for 20 centuries there was nothing to contradict the caricature. The excavations are ongoing. New sites are being examined across the former Carthaginian sphere, from the Balearic Islands to the North African coast to the ports of southern Spain. Each one has the potential to add another correction to a story that historians are only now beginning to acknowledge was never really the story at all. What emerges is not a Carthage without flaws. It is a Carthage that was a pier, not a shadow. A civilization that shaped the Mediterranean as thoroughly as Rome did, whose engineers standardized shipbuilding, whose farmers wrote treatises Rome felt compelled to preserve, whose cities anticipated urban forms Rome would later claim as its own, and whose population reflected the connections of a truly Mediterranean empire. The Roman historian Cato the Elder is famous for ending every speech in the Roman Senate, regardless of its subject, with the same phrase, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. He said it for years. Eventually, Rome listened. What Cato did not say, because he could not have known it, was that destruction of a city is one thing, and destruction of the truth about a city is another. The first took 17 days in 146 BC. The second took 2,000 years, and it is only now beginning to fail. The ground held the evidence longer than the manuscripts did. The bones, the timbers, the seeds, the sequences, all of it waited underneath a landscape that Rome believed it had emptied. When archaeologists finally learned how to read what had been left behind, the story that came out was not the one the winners had written, it was the one the losers had lived. Somewhere in the archives of history, there is a lesson in that about who gets to describe the past. Carthage does not get its libraries back. The volumes distributed to allied kings in 146 BC are gone. What Carthage gets, instead, is a slow rehabilitation through the physical evidence of its own existence, recovered by the descendants of civilizations that never knew it directly, published in languages Carthaginians never spoke. In a world that has now had time to look again at what Rome insisted was settled, the city burned. The story did not survive intact. But the ground remembered, and the ground is beginning to speak.